Let's get started. I am pleased to introduce our panelists. First, we're going to be joined by Morgan Shepard and Yolanda Perkins. Morgan is a program manager on the innovation team at Unbound Ed and manages a range of projects from launching an asynchronous academy for families of multilingual learners to this project we're going to talk about today, which focused on working with California districts to measure ease of implementation with instructional materials. Yolanda is an implementation specialist with the National Implementation Research Network, where she works on a variety of projects focused on ensuring the use of evidence-based practices to meet the needs of all learners. Following Morgan and Yolanda's discussion about the Hexagon tool, we'll hear from Allison Carter, Shanna Estep, and Francisco Viejas. Allison is Vice President of Curriculum Services for Core Learning, where she leads a portfolio focused on educational equity through the adoption and implementation of high-quality instructional materials and aligned, equitable instruction. Shanna is with Ed Reports and is Managing Director of Adoption and Innovation, and in this role, she works to support state and local education systems with their curriculum and instruction initiatives. And Francisco joins us from the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, where he is Senior Vice President of School Transformation and works with education leaders and teachers to plan for and work toward creating powerful and equitable learning environments and experiences for all students. So we have a lot of wonderful minds with us today and a lot to share. So I am going to hand things over to Morgan.
Thanks so much, Emily. Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you here with us today. In today's webinar, we're going to be learning about the development of CalCurriculum's adapted Hexagon tool. We'll discuss takeaways and insights from a recent case study report about math instructional materials implementation, and we will explore necessary steps to guide the development of your district or charter's implementation process. So related to this, during our time together, we'll start with welcome and introductions. Thank you, Emily. I'll begin with some background context for our work, and then we'll dive into an overview of the original Hexagon tool development with Yolanda from NERD, followed by more information from me about how we adapted the tool for our context. I'll then share some more information about our case studies report and lead us into a great panel discussion around key learnings and insights from these case studies. We'll then close out hopefully with some time for questions and answers from you all. So first, to start with some background information for those who aren't familiar, the California Curriculum Collaborative, or CalCurriculum for short, is a joint project of Ed Reports and Unbound Ed, developed and tailored to support California educators. Our goal is to help districts adopt and implement high-quality instructional materials by providing independent reviews, actionable resources, and guidance tailored to the California context. We're grateful for the support of our funder, the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for making this work possible. So I want to begin today by setting the stage for our pilot. As I'm sure many of you are aware, California has taken several steps over the last 13 years in order to improve math instruction, beginning with the adoption of the Common Core State Standards in 2010, and later the Mathematics Framework in 2013 and subsequent Math Adoption List in 2014 in order to support and incorporate those standards into instruction. Since then, so much has changed. We've had a greater focus and transparency into the quality and standards alignment of instructional materials following the launch of Ed Reports in 2015. And there's been much more research dedicated to the impact of high-quality instructional materials. For example, the Opportunity Myth report by TNTP in 2018 found that students have had inconsistent access to high-quality instructional materials, which affects their learning. They found that this was particularly significant for students of color and students experiencing poverty, who had even less access to high-quality standards-aligned materials than their peers on average. However, this report didn't stop at pointing out that access was inequitable. They went on to demonstrate why this mattered. They found that when students who started the year behind had greater access to grade-appropriate assignments, they closed outcomes gaps with their peers by more than 7 months. And that teachers who were using aligned high-quality materials engaged teachers who were using aligned high-quality materials engaged students in mathematical practices at significantly higher rates than teachers who did not have access to an aligned curriculum. Research like this report has shown that having access to high-quality instructional materials is an important piece of the puzzle in improving student outcomes. And this research has made curriculum decision makers in the field more aware of the importance of high quality instructional materials, which has prompted more shifts in recent years towards off-cycle adoptions of off-list materials. So what does this look like in California for middle school math? Well, we got a sneak peek into this last fall. The Center for Education Market Dynamics released a report last fall that illuminated that while 76% of districts in their research sample across California still have products from the 2014 list in place, many of which have now been found by Ed Reports to not be standards aligned materials. There are also 40% of districts that have current selections of off-list curricula for middle school mathematics. This data shows us that there has already been momentum in the field to move towards high quality instructional materials, which, coming back to our California Math Journey timeline, has now been fueled further by the adoption of the most recent California mathematics mathematics framework last July. As we look ahead to the upcoming mathematics adoption list in 2025, we know that there will continue to be a lot of attention focused on the adoption of high quality instructional materials. In the interim, while districts continue to make greater shifts towards adopting high quality instructional materials, a significant question remains. What does it take to implement these materials successfully so that they have their intended impact? While researchers and experts have rigorously investigated and reviewed instructional materials over the last decade, not enough attention has been focused on the factors that affect their implementation. And that is what brings us to our pilot project goals. First, knowing that charting a strong implementation plan is crucial to maximizing the impact of high quality instructional materials, we wanted to develop a tool that can be used both during a team's adoption process, looking ahead towards implementation planning, or during implementation to assess progress in areas for improvement. Second, utilizing the indicators from this tool as the investigative framework, we wanted to study the degree to which select programs have been feasible to implement across a variety of district and charter profiles, and the conditions that enable successful instructional materials implementation through a set of case studies. We started this process back in the fall of 2022 by interviewing 10 internal staff with experience in math instructional materials adoption and implementation to learn more about a framework that would allow us to assess the ease of implementing instructional materials, the key criteria that affect instructional materials implementation experiences, and the format or structure of a tool that could be useful to district and charter leaders. So we asked them, one, in your experience, what has been the easiest or most difficult curriculum to implement and why? Two, what criteria have you observed to affect a district or school's success with implementation? And what kinds of questions do you think they need to be asking to assess this? And three, what format or structure of a tool do you think would be most helpful to the district and school leaders? In order to accomplish our goals of developing a tool that would support districts and charters in this reflection and planning work, and could act as an investigative framework for our case studies, we conducted extensive secondary research and found a tool that aligned with many of the key criteria findings that arose from our interviews, which was the Hexagon Discussion and Analysis Tool, which was originally developed by the National Implementation Research Network, commonly known as NIRN. I'll now hand it over to Yolanda from NIRN. Yolanda and the NIRN team have deep expertise in the field of implementation science, and we've been grateful to collaborate with them throughout our adaptation process. Yolanda is going to share more about the background and original development of this tool.
Thank you, Morgan. Before we start reviewing the Hexagon tool, I just want to give you a little bit of background information on how and why it was developed. And I'll start with just explaining how it relates to our work at NIRN. So at NIRN, we base our work on the active implementation formula and frameworks as shown here on the screen. And basically what this formula notes is that to get socially significant outcomes, there are three components involved: having an effective practice, utilizing effective implementation strategies and methods, and ensuring that the context is supportive of the implementation. So Dean Fixon and Karen Blase were strategic in making the active implementation formula into a basic multiplication problem to emphasize that all three of those components are critical for the success in reaching the socially significant outcomes. So as we know, in a multiplication problem, If any of the components are 0, then our outcome will be 0. And in this visual, underneath each of those components of the formula are the various frameworks that NERN developed based on the implementation research that comprise methods and tools focused on active implementation. So today we're going to talk about effective practices. At NERN, we want to make sure that districts and organizations are adopting innovations that are usable, meaning that the program, practice, or strategy is teachable, learnable, doable, and can be easily assessed in practice. And the first step in having a usable innovation is to select a usable innovation. Next slide, perfect. And so the selection process generally occurs in the beginning stages of implementation. At NERN, we refer to this as the exploration stage. In this stage, districts or organizations begin to assess the need, fit, and feasibility of an innovation. And the staff may be asking questions such as, should we even adopt anything new? And what is the best choice? And to help determine those answers, staff should engage in readiness activities and a comprehensive selection process to examine the critical features of the innovation to determine if it should be selected. This is where the hexagon tool comes into play. Now, although the hexagon tool is often used in the exploration stage, it can be used in any implementation stage. Teams may want to or need to revisit their selection of an innovation to help determine if there are areas that need to be addressed to strengthen implementation. So what is this hexagon tool that we're talking about today? The hexagon tool is a systems level technical assistance tool that was developed to help school districts, communities, and organizations make informed choices with their innovation selection. The first iteration of it was developed in the early 2000s, and then NERN later worked with the Annie E. Casey Foundation to ensure that the tool centered on equity. So the hexagon tool process includes involving and engaging diverse perspectives and using multiple methods and data sources to support effective implementation and sustainability potential. So now, as I mentioned, it is a technical assistance tool, and it has not been empirically investigated, but it has been used in research, including state curriculum adoption, school improvement processes, and organizational readiness for intervention adoption in mental health, public health, criminal justice, pharmacy, and K-12 education. And if you would like to learn more about how the hexagon tool has been used, I encourage you to just go out, do a quick Google Scholar search, and you'll see that the hexagon tool is mentioned or used in thousands of research articles. So let's take a look at the factors of the hexagon tool. The hexagon tool is framed around 6 indicators that need to be considered when selecting evidence-based practices or programs. A focus on equitable outcomes for the focal population is embedded within each one of these indicators. So first we have the implementing site indicators, and these are need, fit, and capacity. They assess the extent to which a new or existing program or practice aligns with the implementing site. So I'll start with need. The need indicator focuses on understanding the context of the implementing site. This is where the team identifies the focus population. This is the population whose outcomes they're seeking to impact. And the team will need to use multiple data sources, including disaggregated data, to understand the needs and assets of that focus population, as well as the community's perception of the needs and assets. And then next, there's fit. Once the team has an understanding of the context, they would look at how well the innovation fits with the values, culture, history, and priorities of the implementing site. So as our NERN director, Karen Ward, likes to say, fit is our tricky wiki indicator when we are using the hexagon tool. Because there are times that districts need to challenge the way that things have been done previously if they want to reach socially significant outcomes. So teams really would need to think about what philosophies are being considered when determining fit. So just an example, literacy instruction continues to be a focus in education, with many school districts across the nation moving towards the science of reading and phonics-based instruction. However, if you have a district that has always leaned toward whole language instruction, a new phonics-based program may not necessarily fit the district in terms of their historical perspective. But a shift may be needed to get the socially significant outcomes desired as they relate to student growth and achievement. And then there's capacity. This is thinking about what resources are needed and what resources are available to implement the program or practice. So for instance, teams have to consider if they have the funds, the money to be able to provide training and purchase the materials. They also need to ensure that they have the human resources to teach and coach the use of those materials. And then they need to make sure they have time allocated to train, coach, and use the program. So now I'll review just quickly the program indicators, which are evidence, usability, and supports. These indicators focus on the innovation, which is the program or practice that's going to be implemented. So I'll start with evidence. This is where teams consider multiple data types to determine if the innovation is effective. They may look at outcome data, they may look at fidelity data, or cost effectiveness data. And those are just a few examples. But teams need to consider the sample used in the data collection. They have to think about whether that sample is reflective of their context. And then they also need to consider how the data was collected and what level of data was collected. So for instance, they need to think about whether street level data was included. So then there's usability. This is where the team will examine the components of the program or practice and ask questions of themselves, such as, is this program or practice well defined? Does it have a fidelity or integrity measure? And can it be adapted for different contexts and populations? And then our last program indicator listed here is supports. Teams need to consider what external supports, such as assistance and resources, are available. For instance, if a district is looking to adopt a math program, the team should examine if the curriculum developer has provided online guides or materials explaining how to utilize the program or possibly adapt the lessons. So that is just a brief overview of each of the hexagon tool indicators. As the team works together and considers and discusses each of these indicators, they need to really use these questions and a 5-point rubric to rate each indicator. The discussion and the ratings can then be used to support the team with making the decision to adopt or possibly deselect a program or practice. So at NERM, we do emphasize that a total of the rating should not be used. It's not about the score. And that teams should not use the ratings as the sole determinants for final recommendations. So the hexagon tool is really about discussion and information gathering. Again, not about a score, okay? So instead of rejecting a program or practice because some indicators are rated low, the team should consider if it is possible and worth it to strengthen those lower rated indicators. And if so, then they can use that information to develop implementation action planning steps. So now I'm going to turn it over to Morgan to explain how the hexagon tool was adapted.
Thank you, Yolanda. So now that you have a little bit more information about the background and development of the original hexagon tool, I'm going to share a little bit more about our process to adapt the tool for Cal Curriculum's focus on instructional materials adoption and implementation. As I mentioned earlier, we began by interviewing several internal staff about their own adoption and implementation experiences, including criteria that they observed to affect whether the experience was challenging or successful. After the interviews, we then coded the data, identified recurring themes across interviews, and developed key topics that were then integrated into the first version of our adapted hexagon tool. As you can see in the example here with the fit indicator section questions, the initial adapted version of our tool had a mix of what you can see in black, the original hexagon tool question language. What you see is in blue, these were questions that were added in or language specifically based on the interviews that we found related to instructional materials adoption and implementation. So for example, how does it align with the district or charter's instructional vision? And then you'll also see a lot of overlap between the original hexagon tool wording and our key findings from the interviews, which you can see in orange. For example, is there a plan to facilitate buy-in for staff, key stakeholders, and collaborative partners? Moving forward from this initial adapted draft, the adaptation process for the tool and case studies investigative framework was shaped by feedback from both our project testing group, made up of 11 practitioners in the field, and our project advisory council, composed of 9 adoption and implementation networks. Experts. We first shared the initial adapted tool with our project advisory council, which is composed of 5 internal and 4 external adoption and implementation experts, and received helpful feedback on the tool structure, guidance, questions, and ratings descriptions. Following incorporation of this feedback, we then shared an updated version of our adapted tool with our project testing group, including current teachers, coaches, and district and charter leaders from across California, as well as consultants who lead math adoption and implementation work across sites. We engaged individual user testing, sorry, back one slide, with each of these testing group participants, walking them through an adoption scenario based on their own experiences, and then gathering feedback on the tool structure, guidance, questions, and ratings descriptions. After adapting the tool and receiving feedback from our advisory council, testing group, and internal team members, we finalized the adapted tool that is available on the Cal Curriculum site today. With this adapted tool, we envision 2 main use case scenarios. So if you're interested and haven't checked it out yet, it's in the chat right now. The first case scenario that we envision is during the instructional materials adoption process. So let's say your district or charter is going through the adoption process and you've narrowed it down to your final 2 or 3 options. This tool would then prompt you to consider what would implementation look like for your context. So you could decide, yes, we can manage a successful implementation within our current context. So this would be a great option for us. If you want to click, that's the first one. Second, no, actually, after going through these questions, we've realized this is going to be too difficult for us to implement successfully, and this might not be a good choice for us. Or third, perhaps after going through this tool and these questions, we've realized that in order to implement successfully, we're going to have to make some changes, but we do feel like this is the right choice for us, so we're going to move forward planning ahead for those implementation changes. After going through the user testing process with our testing group participants, we heard some really promising feedback from leaders who would envision using the tool in adoption scenarios like this. So one district leader shared, I wish I had this tool 6 months ago. If we'd gone through some of these questions, I think it would have altered what we chose to pilot this fall. Another leader shared, this tool is amazing. I already sent a copy of this to a teammate I'm working with to lead our adoption process because these questions are so important to think about. The other scenario in which we envision our tool being used is during implementation. So for example, if a district or charter is in the midst of implementation and wants to evaluate how it's going, you could use this tool to consider each of the tool's indicator domains for the current materials. So then based on this, you could decide either one, we're going to stay the course, implementation is going quite successfully in the current setup, and here are some of the reasons why that we've uncovered. 2, actually, these materials are not working for us. We've realized perhaps these weren't the right materials for our context, and we need to consider some major changes for our system. Or 3, maybe there are some changes needed. We're going to stay the course with these materials, but we need to make some changes for implementation to go successfully. And we've identified some key areas where we can consider making adjustments. A quote from a recent article from an Ed Week market brief hit on exactly why we feel it's so important to have a tool that helps teams and leaders focus on planning for implementation. Kevin Dykema, the president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, shared that sometimes we get so focused on high quality resources, but how are we implementing those high quality resources? And are we providing the teachers the tools and support they need to make the necessary changes in their instruction to better meet the needs of students? So this brings me to our case studies report. We wanted to bring more attention to this question of how are we implementing instructional materials? And we wanted to learn more and share more about what are the factors that are leading to successful instructional materials implementation. Similar to the use case of utilizing the tool to evaluate an implementation experience, we wanted to study and uplift the internal learnings that a district or charter might uncover through going through this reflection process on their own, but often are not publicly shared or discussed more widely. Our goal with the case studies portion of this project, is the next slide, was to study and share learnings on the conditions for successful instructional materials implementation and the degree to which select programs have been feasible to implement across a variety of district and charter profiles. So in order to do this, we interviewed teams from districts and charters across California to share their implementation experiences with middle school mathematics instructional materials, and then published a set of anonymous case studies about their best practices and lessons learned from these implementation experiences. Similar to the adaptation process for the tool, in order to prepare for the case studies, we first adapted the tool to be a retrospective focus group protocol, and then tested the updated interview protocol with our testing group by walking through 2 implementation scenarios with each participant based on their own experiences to gather similar feedback as the first round of testing. Based on the feedback from our testing group, advisory council, and a group of key internal stakeholders, we landed on a finalized focus group investigative framework, which is included in the appendix of the case studies report. We then began a recruitment process, which was open to all districts and charters across California, to interview a range of district and charter size and types, as well as a variety of instructional materials, and move forward with our applied case study research. Our report, which includes a case study on a set of materials from the 2014 adoption list and 3 case studies with off-list instructional materials, provides a small snapshot into the multitude of deeper stories behind the data around which materials are currently used in California and the factors that have influenced whether the materials have been a good fit for their district or charter in implementation. In total, there were 4 participating district and charter teams reviewing 4 sets of instructional materials. Case study 1 is about a very large district that has been implementing HMH's Go Math California edition, which was on the 2014 California adoption list for the last 8 years. Case study 2 is about a mid-size CMO who has been implementing 2 versions of illustrative math, both Open Up Resources 6 to 8 Math and Kendall Hunt's Illustrative Mathematics, both of which are off list for the past 7 years. Case study 3 is about a small CMO who has also been implementing a version of illustrative math, Open Up Resources 6 to 8 Math, another off-list selection for the past 5 years. And a case study 4, we see a story about a large district that has been implementing Curriculum Associates Ready Mathematics and more recently updated iReady Classroom Mathematics, both of which are off list for the past 5 years. I'm really excited to bring together 3 experts today in the fields of math instructional materials adoption and implementation. Allison Carter, Vice President of Curriculum Services at Core Learning, who served on our Project Advisory Council. Shanez Stepp, Managing Director of Adoption and Innovation at EdReports, who's a key leader on our Cal Curriculum team and provided invaluable feedback on our project publications. And Francisco Villegas, the Senior Vice President of School Transformation at the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, who also served on our Project Advisory Council. They'll be discussing key highlights and takeaways from these case studies, bringing in their own experiences and expertise, and sharing how these insights can guide districts and charters with setting up a strong implementation process. So we'll pause with the slides now, and if you 3 want to come on camera, we're gonna turn this into just a discussion. I would love to start by hearing from each of you. Which of these case studies or stories resonated the most with your experience with high quality instructional materials adoption and implementation? And what about them resonated with you? Perhaps Shannon, we can start with you.
Yes, thanks again, Morgan, for having me. Excited for the conversation today and to hear from my amazing colleagues. I would just say that the very first case study number 1, I had a hard time getting beyond that one actually, because it struck me as an example of what I experienced as an educator here in California schools and school districts, and also what I see regularly in my work nationally with EdReports. You have a relatively large school district who has maybe some inefficient or ineffective historical practices in place. no real vision for how the materials could support them. A one-shot, one-day publisher PD. And while you can't see exactly what the steps of their adoption process were, you can see that it's just, not even surface level data gathering happened, or an understanding of like what the district's needs are or were. It really does speak to how, and I'll speak from my experience, historically, we've adopted materials in California. And now we're in a new place, which is great. But I will say that if folks don't really understand why a particular set of materials were selected or are being selected, and that comes directly based on who your students are, who your teachers are, what their needs are, and materials are chosen off a list. Or, I know lots of people just go to Ed Reports, they see the green and they're like, great, it's green, it's for me. But if we don't really have a clear understanding of why a particular set of materials are selected, and then teachers aren't really given the kind of support they need to implement those materials. So for example, let's say we've chosen some materials that maybe we're trying to change some practice in mathematics or literacy, either one. If we don't know why we've chosen those materials, and we don't support teachers then to use those materials to help further our goals, it really becomes difficult for teachers to do the thing if they don't have the support to do it, or they don't know why or the purpose behind it. So, and I think, finally, I'll say that without a really, really clear vision of what effective, in this case, mathematics, effective teaching and learning looks like in mathematics, without a very clear picture and a shared understanding of what that looks like, we're kind of shooting in the dark, right? Materials at this point should be a lever toward school improvement, right? Student achievement, teacher practice, bettering teacher practice. They actually can support all of those things, but without a clear vision of like what we're looking for, what our hopes and dreams are for kiddos in mathematics, then using those materials to do that without like understanding why they were selected or the kind of support that would be needed to implement them, really then your implementation fails, and you wind up with shrink wrapped materials on shelves, or books that are really kind of never opened. And schools just don't have that kind of time, resource, and general capital to waste there. So yeah, that's the one that resonated with me most.
Thank you, Shanna. That was so helpful to hear, and I'm sure resonates with a lot of the audience as well. Francisco, what about you?
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. Hi, everyone. And yes, definitely agree with all of the points that Shanna made. I also work in a large urban school district, and I also saw a lot of connections with Case Study 2, which happens to be a charter management organization that selected materials that were actually aligned to their instructional vision. However, they didn't include the people who would actually be implementing the materials in their adoption or selection process. Of course, this negatively impacted their implementation in the early years. What was really interesting about this study was that even though it negatively impacted their implementation in the early years, leaders were able to get things back on track because they were carefully and thoughtfully monitoring the implementation of the materials, and then they were able to respond to what they were seeing as needs of teachers. And that is really, really important. We may or may not get it all right at the beginning, but monitoring what we expect is critically important. And then doing something in a supportive way to respond is also really important. So this points, from my perspective, to the important connection between adoption and implementation. It is important that we're thinking about adoption and implementation together, because what you adopt has many implications for implementation. So one of the things that I'll just put out there is that adoption processes that focus on consensus decision-making lead to more ownership of the decision and also have positive impacts of that on the implementation. Lastly, for this particular study, when you look at the fit system indicator rationale for this, we can see that this charter management organization had a challenge that most LEAs have: competing concurrent initiatives, a lack of focus and prioritization of the implementation of the materials. It's really important that we remember that there are no silver bullets. So it's important that we don't think of high quality instructional materials this way. However, when effectively implemented, high quality instructional materials, to the points that Shanna made, they have the potential to support your LEA's progress towards your instructional vision. We have to understand, however, that in order for this potential to be unlocked, we as leaders have to believe that high quality instructional materials are a critical component to reaching our vision. And then we have to do the work to focus on the implementation supports that are needed throughout the process. I'll end by saying it's really not, it sounds like a lot, it's really not that difficult to get there, but we have to make the space and time in our LEAs to have the conversations that are needed to have a really thoughtful adoption process that's coupled with thinking about implementation.
Go for it, Allison. I see you're ready to jump on to that.
That was okay. Good morning. The question, which case study resonated with me? I'm going to cheat a little bit and say both the first and second. The second case study really resonated with me, similar to what Francisco was sharing, really about the bringing people along in the adoption process because of the importance of that for implementation. So if you're not bringing them along in the adoption process, then when you get to implementation, you don't have the buy-in and investment you need to have a successful launch. So that's one piece of why the second case study resonated with me. Another piece of that case study is that, one of the things we found is there are many school districts and CMOs who have traditionally been very autonomous. And they have traditionally adopted and implemented materials school by school. And we know to implement high quality instructional materials successfully that it is a whole systems change. It requires very big lift in time, structures, process. It also requires coherence and consistency across the district. And so we know that although autonomy is wonderful, for this particular kind of area of work, you really do need to adopt and implement it across the district system. So that's one piece. And then the case study one, where it really resonated with me was just knowing that it's very common, or it was historically very common in the recent past, for districts to not know if their materials were not aligned to the standards and were, not high quality. And thanks to organizations like EdReports and others, it has become a lot less common. But we're still addressing the issues that districts are facing who adopted many, many years ago and haven't adopted new materials yet. And so they still have materials that are not aligned to standards. And so I just want to put it out there, the urgency, right, to adopt new high quality instructional materials if you haven't gotten there yet, if you haven't done that yet, and that there's a lot more out there now than there was 13 years ago. And that it is a priority. It should be a priority to get this in front of your kids if you, really serious about making a big impact. So that is why case study one really resonated with me.
Thank you all for those valuable insights. So as you were just saying, Allison, there's this urgency around needing to adopt high quality instructional materials, which might not currently be the case in all districts and charters across California or elsewhere. And we know that there's momentum towards that now with the adoption of the framework and looking ahead towards the next adoption list. So we know that 3 of the case studies, the last 3, focus on the more recent off-list instructional materials that are aligned with the recently released California math framework. And that would love to hear from the 3 of you Based on the learnings from these case studies and your own adoption and implementation experiences, what do you think is important for districts and charters to keep in mind who might be considering adopting similar materials? So I know, Francisco, you mentioned the importance of like thinking about both adoption and implementation together. So for people on this call who might be thinking ahead towards future adoptions, what's important to keep in mind if they're considering adopting similar materials in the near future? Perhaps, Francisco, we can start this time with you.
Sure. Thank you, Morgan. I'll start by sharing what we've learned at the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools from 10 years of doing this work of adopting high quality instructional materials, multiple versions, and also doing a lot of implementation work and learning a lot. I'll say that we have actually used the National Implementation Research Network's resources, especially around the implementation drivers once you get into the implementation stage of things. If you're interested in learning more, they have the National Implementation Research Network's Active Implementation Hub. That's where I used to go to learn as a district leader what I could be doing better. And it was a really helpful resource. We've also taken a lot of time to really clarify what it is that we've been learning by doing this work for the past 10 years. So I'm going to share with you some key learnings around effective implementation of high quality instructional materials and creating system coherence. What we've learned is that this requires discipline in 5 key areas. First, lead with a vision and help leaders define fidelity or integrity in that context, your context. Second, define the data that you're going to use to track progress. We heard from Yolanda how important it is to think about measurement, and that has actually been a very key learning for us. We used to think about that later in the process, but now we start with that. Here's our vision. How do we measure progress towards that vision? Not just tracking student outcomes all the time. While that's an important data point, it's not the only data point. There are also really important implementation data points that we need to be paying attention to. Next, keep a people-centered approach to change management. It's really easy when we're doing implementation efforts to forget that these are people doing the implementation. And so we have to be supportive and think about, listen to what people need, what they're telling us they need, and actually respond by supporting them with those needs. Plan for support and intervention at all layers in the district or charter management organization. This one is so critical. It took us a long time to learn this, but we used to focus so much on just teacher professional learning. And what we have learned is that professional learning and capacity building is needed at every level of a system, including at the district level. We have to start with ourselves. What learning do we have to do? And then lastly, once you have those pieces down, now we're really thinking about how do we create systems, build systems that are going to create durable change? Because it happens so often in education that we start something, it doesn't go well, we abandon it and we move on to the next thing. But how do we create the systems that will lead to that durable change? I'll end by just saying it's really important to start now. Don't wait. I know a lot of people are waiting for a list to come out. Don't wait. It's critical that you start with what is your vision? What are you working towards? You're not working towards materials. You're working towards something really important, and the materials are a tool to help you get there.
Thank you, Francisco. So important. Allison, how does this align with your work and your perspective?
Yeah. So we'll totally agree with everything that Francisco said. At CORE, we talk about our 6 conditions for successful curriculum implementation, because we know that curriculum adoption and implementation are systems changes. And so those 6 conditions roughly kind of start with an implementation team and an adoption committee and an implementation team when you're talking about adoption and implementation at the district level. And starting during the adoption process, so early on, really prioritizing the instructional vision and make sure you have one. And then that instructional vision setting the direction for the adoption process and the implementation. So you have that coherence across the 2 processes, adoption and implementation. Outside of the implementation team, another condition is having an intentional launch. So that's something that we have found that not all districts do. They procure the materials, of course, they provide materials training, but really from the district level, developing the implementation plan and thinking about how you can successfully launch those new materials as these systems change. And then the next part related to that implementation plan is developing your goals and your strategy and thinking about measurement. And Francisco mentioned this before of how important measurement is, because you're not just measuring the long-term impact, but you're also going to want to measure your iterative improvements in the implementation of those materials and shifts in practice. So that you can target your professional learning to best align with the needs of your educators that are aligned to the implementation of the materials. So that's another part, right, is having a professional learning strategy and plan with robust support that is job embedded and ongoing. So not just that materials training, although that's important. And your professional learning strategy and plan should also be targeted at leaders. So that's one of the things that we do at CORE. All of our support is focused at the district level with district leaders and at the school site level with school site leadership teams. And we understand that is extremely important. Obviously, it's important to get teachers the support that they need, but oftentimes we know that we, as districts, historically, we don't always prioritize the leaders, and the leaders are really the people in the building who are going to make sure that one, the work is sustained after, the first push happens, right? That it's sustained ongoing for multiple years. And then also they are the first, they're people responsible, right, for making sure that teachers get the support that they need. So making sure that leaders deeply understand the materials, and then they also understand how to support teachers to implement the materials. And then another big piece, which Francisco also mentioned, is the importance of bringing the people along and thinking about people, because this is a systems change that is driven by humans. And so change management is very important in thinking through what is your strategy for shifting expectations and mindsets along the way. And then the last piece, kind of the last condition, is thinking about after that first launch and those first year or two, how do you sustain this? How do you make sure that what you're building is sustainable and that it's also scalable? Because what you're doing, if you're, say, implementing math materials in middle school, right? Those are the practices that you put in place can be scaled to high school, can be scaled to elementary school, can be scaled to literacy. So really thinking about how you can sustain and scale that work, and leaders and engaging your leaders along the way is actually a very important strategy for sustainability and scalability. And the last piece, last piece that I'll add that Francisco mentioned that I just want to double click on is that if you have already started to implement your materials and you have high quality instructional materials that are green on ed reports, and you've been implementing for a few years and you're not seeing success, it's not too late. So there's always an opportunity to reset. So you can start all this from the beginning with adoption. It's important to start things early on if you can, but if you're already into your implementation and you need to reset, you will definitely see success if you do that reset intentionally. And it's never too late. So I just want to double click on that.
Thank you, Allison. And Shannon, would love to hear from you. What advice would you offer to districts and charters considering adopting materials like this?
Well, my two colleagues have already shared their genius. So I have just a couple of things I would add. Yes, to both Francisco and Allison, those 6 conditions for success are, we base our work on those things as well. I would say something slightly controversial. I love being a controversial person. A lot of districts are waiting for the list right now, and the list can be helpful. A state list can be helpful, right? And I've been in education in California a really long time. I remember the days when we had 2 options on the state list. Last time we had 29 options on the list. So a state list can be helpful, but it is only helpful to the extent that that list has been vetted for quality. And in the past, I cannot speak to this future review, but in the past, we have actually been told by the Assistant Superintendent of Instruction at the California Department of Education that the IQC work and the review work, so that's the making of the list, they don't look at quality. They're not looking for quality. They have their own checklist of things that are important and it's embedded in the framework, and there are certain social content check boxes that they're looking for. They are not vetting for quality. They're not looking at a lesson. It's the standard is quoted in the lesson, and they're not looking at the work that students are actually doing and making sure that the work students are producing is aligned to the standard that is quoted on the page. That's not the kind of, they don't have the time to do that. So if the list was vetted around quality, then I would say, yes, we should wait for that list. We should see what, publishers might be thinking about. However, in the past, that's not a place that you should be looking. The state list is not a place that you should be waiting for, because there are other ways to look for quality materials. Now, publishers are taking up what is in the framework, and they will be making adjustments to potentially their national product, is my guess, so that it aligns with the California framework and the things that have been called out in the framework as far as like rearranging around big ideas and those kinds of things. But for the most part, you could be, and we're working with districts right now in California who are adopting right now in California. They're looking at materials that technically haven't been adjusted yet for the California framework, but the publisher will be adjusting. So what they're looking at right now is maybe a national set of materials, and they're looking for the alignment to their priorities. We talked about a vision, right? We talked about making sure that you've looked at data and you know what the purpose of the materials are. But there are ways to start now, just like my colleagues have said, because really we know thousands of kids are missing out on materials that are better suited to their needs, and teachers deserve high quality instructional materials too. I am looking at I have a couple of other things to say, but I'm looking at the time, Morgan, and I want to make sure, number one, that we end on time. Number two, that I see there are some questions in the chat. And so I'm going to yield my time.
We clearly could spend a lot more time talking about all of these topics. There's
For sure.
so much to learn from you all. And also in relation to the learnings from these case studies, we just often don't have access to these types of deep reflections and learnings from districts and charters. We could continue with more questions. I think that we will pause here. I think just to speak to Shanna's point that she was just talking about, if you are someone who is on the call today and you're interested in adopting earlier off list before that list does come out, do check out the Cal Curriculum website. There's a lot of information, guidance, and resources on there if you are interested in adopting early and off list, as well as the independent reports from EdReport to be checking out instructional materials on your own. There's a criteria review guide if you're interested in looking at the supports in there for multilingual learners. So do check out that website. There's a lot of helpful resources on there for you. Thank you so much, Shanna, Francisco, and Allison. Such valuable learnings from you all. And thank you, Yolanda, for being here from NERN today. It's been such a valuable opportunity to learn from all of you. And Emily, we will hand it back over to you.
Well, thank you. Yes, this time went by way too fast, clearly. But we do have a couple questions and we have a few minutes to take them. So we'll just get through what we can and go from there. And for those of you that do need to drop off, just a reminder, we are going to share the recording, lots of resources that we've been sharing in chat, and the slide deck. So stay tuned for that. First off, does the adapted hexagon tool align with district teacher evaluation tools? And there's a second part to that question, but I'll leave that first part hanging there.
That's a great big question. There was not particular work to be aligning the hexagon tool to particular district teacher evaluation tools. Obviously, for the purposes of CalCurriculum's goals, we are focused on California. However, this is a tool that could be used outside of California as well. I'm not exactly sure where this person is based. But I think that the goal of the hexagon tool was to be pointing leaders and teams towards the important questions to be asking. So if you see that this is something that is going to be affecting, teacher mindset, teacher capacity, is it going to be affecting instructional coach capacity, school leader or district capacity? Those are pieces that we heard from leaders have affected their implementation experiences in the past and would be important to consider when you're looking ahead to particular sets of instructional materials. So not aligned to a particular one, but it is asking about questions in relation to this and thinking about, is it the right fit for your district or charter?
We also had a couple questions, and this was part B of that first question, but some other folks have chimed in too, just about professional learning, in particular provided to administrators, so that what they're doing is, aligning with and supporting the California math framework.
We've definitely heard a lot about that across the case studies and the importance of that. And I think that Francisco, Allison, and Shannon would all be well positioned to answer or share more about that. I'll let one of them or any more jump in.
I'll just quickly say that, like I was speaking to before, at least the work that we do through core and implementation of materials, we focus on leaders as the primary focus of our work, and the professional learning we think of as broader than trainings. So it is job embedded and ongoing. And so professional learning also comes in the form of doing walks with leaders, with school leaders, having meetings with school leadership teams, helping them looking at their data after they've done those walks, and identifying problems of practice and action steps that they can take as school leaders to support their teachers. And professional learning, of course, is embedded in all of that. Of course, there's specific professional learning you want to do with your site leaders and your district leaders around the materials you've adopted and understanding the instructional routines and all of that as well. But all that to say, professional learning plan and strategy is broad, and for teachers and for leaders, and for us specifically, leaders focused on both getting in there and doing walks, and also doing trainings.
That was helpful. Francisco or Shanna, do you want to chime in on that?
I'll just quickly say that it's really important to get clear on what it is that we're looking for during implementation. So as Allison just shared, when you're going and doing walks and observations, what are you looking for? And are we aligned as a system? Because that coherence and that alignment amongst leadership teams is really, really important so that we're not giving teachers different types of feedback and confusing them throughout the process.
Great. Well, we'll take one more question. We might go just a minute or two over the top of the hour, but do you have any, and this is probably a huge question too, but do you have thoughts or advice for districts who may want to pilot materials in just a couple schools rather than implementing system-wide right out of the gate? Just things to keep in mind when you might be choosing that route.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jessica. I mean, I think when you're thinking about piloting materials, you have to really think about what the purpose for the pilot is, right? So if you're going to pilot or field test, we like call it field test. If you're going to pilot or field test your materials to make a decision, right? You're using these materials to help you make a decision about which set of materials you might go with. You're going to want to make sure as many eyes and hands can get on those materials as possible. So limiting to certain schools is probably not the greatest idea, because then you want to build investment in these programs, and that's not the best way to do that. However, if you've got a set of materials materials that you think could potentially be the thing, right? You've either already made the decision or you think you're pretty close to this decision, but you want to try a pilot of those materials to learn from the materials, right? So you've chosen something math book and you're going to roll it out at 2 schools or 3 schools in the first, you want to get folks who are really excited about using these materials, a coalition of the willing, if you will, to jump on the first year so that you're using that pilot to actually learn about the materials, learn from the materials, learn from the educators who are using the materials, the students, families, etc. And you've got some way to keep track of that so that the full rollout maybe is in year 2 or year 3 or however you structure that, then that can totally work. My big emphasis would be purpose, and make sure you've got some way to track whatever information it is you're trying to collect. So if it's for a selection, what are you asking teachers to track so you can make the decision? And if you're implementing, just like the first year of an implementation, a pilot for implementation, you're also very aware of what you're tracking so that you're learning and you're able to make those adjustments in that second year, that second phase, if you will, of your implementation.
Thank you all again for being here with us today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in later events. Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.